Opening: The Tumultuous Years in America. America in the 1970s and early 1980s was a country standing at the crossroads of transformation and turmoil, a nation whose bright promise was interlaced with shadows of unrest and violence. Against the glamorous backdrop of disco balls, rock and roll, and the rise of Hollywood blockbusters, a different, darker narrative was unfolding in city streets, quiet suburbs, and the hearts of ordinary citizens. The Vietnam War's aftershocks lingered in living rooms and political halls, while the Watergate scandal chipped away at public faith in the government. Urban decay haunted cities like New York, Detroit, and St. Louis. Crime rates soared, and many Americans for the first time lived in persistent fear of home invasions, muggings, and caseloads that stumped even the most experienced detectives. The American dream felt increasingly elusive as inflation ballooned, unemployment lines lengthened, and the chasm between rich and poor seemed to grow wider by the month. Tensions simmered regarding race, gender, and economic equality, fueling civil rights marches, strikes, and protests. Young people rebelled against old norms and sought meaning in new movements, from peace activism to disco dancing, that left older generations baffled and anxious. Beneath the surface, however, a subtler anxiety pulsed, a suspicion that maybe, just maybe, evil could wear the face of everyday decency. In that climate of uncertainty, stories began to surface across national news, tales of serial crime so baffling in their execution, so cold in their calculation that they challenged everything people thought they knew about their neighbors and communities. Ordinary men, trustworthy, industrious, sometimes even heroic by day, revealed themselves as predators by night. These dark lives, hidden in plain sight, became chilling, cautionary tales, performed in the living rooms of America through sensational headlines and nightly broadcasts. It is in this volatile cauldron of fear, skepticism, and shifting social tides that our story begins. The case at the heart of this narrative is not just an aberration, but a reflection of the era's pervasive anxieties and fractured trust. What unfolded over a decade shook the nation's faith not only in its institutions, but also in its most basic beliefs about good and evil, heroism and villainy, and proved, with grim certainty, that the most dangerous monsters might be closer than anyone ever dared imagine. Setting: From the heartland to the glittering lights of New York. To truly understand the depths of this particular American crime story, one must journey across the starkly contrasting geographies that shaped its trajectory. From the storied heartland of Midwest America to the blinding brilliance of New York City, our tale originates in St. Louis, Missouri, a city cradled on the banks of the Mississippi River, famous for its towering Gateway Arch and historical reputation as the Gateway to the West. St. Louis is a crossroads both literally and metaphorically. The 1970s found it in decline, struggling with depopulation, racial strife, and the economic shockwaves of manufacturing jobs leaving for the coasts or overseas. A patchwork of charming old neighborhoods stood beside derelict warehouses and blocks riddled with poverty, all under the watchful eyes of families clinging to old traditions or anxiously eyeing the future. The social fabric here was complex, a melting pot of ethnicities brought together by the promise of opportunity, but too often divided by invisible lines of class and color. Children played on cracked sidewalks outside brick row houses, while parents worried about the future, jobs vanishing, schools suffering, and crime an ever-present threat. It is in these streets that our main character's early life unfolded, marked by both stability and a nagging sense of not quite belonging. The city's contradictions shaped him, the warmth of community and the coldness of judgment, the potential for both redemption and ruin. But St. Louis is only the beginning. As the story expands, so too does the stage. The American heartland gives way to the thunderous sprawl of Chicago, the blue-collar grit of Detroit, the hard-edged realism of Cleveland. Each new city offers both fresh starts and fresh hazards. The nation was on the move, highways filled with restless souls chasing dreams or running from shadows. Eventually the journey arrives in New York City, the city that never sleeps. Here, the scale shifts dramatically. New York in the early 80s teems with life and danger in equal measure. The unchecked energy of Wall Street, the ethereal lights of Broadway, and the heaving bustle of immigrants and native New Yorkers alike form a frenetic background. Manhattan's skyline gleams, new glass towers rising as monuments to ambition. But below, on the subway platforms and in the dimly lit alleyways, a more desperate reality festers. This is a New York plagued by blackouts, heroin dens, and notorious crime sprees, yet also glorified in movies, television, and the national imagination as a city of endless possibility. In tracing this path, from Midwest to East Coast, the story becomes uniquely and unmistakably American. The scenery shift from the dust and promise of Middle America to the dizzying vertical dreams and dangers of the nation's greatest urban labyrinth. With every mile, the boundaries of morality, belonging, and personal destiny blur further. These landscapes of struggle and aspiration are not just settings, but active agents in the making and unmaking of the man at the heart of our tale. Main character, the two faces of Howard K. West. Howard K. West was, at first glance, the very embodiment of American promise. Born in 1948 on the outskirts of Kansas City, he entered the world to a family that had worked hard to carve out a small measure of stability, a two-story house, a decent yard, the hope that their children might inherit not just property, but possibility. Howard's older sister was studious and gentle. She became the pride of their parents. By contrast, Howard was a constant source of worry, a boy with a restless spirit and a knack for both charm and mischief. From an early age, Howard seemed at war with constraint. While his classmates sat obediently through class, Howard was often plotting minor rebellions, sneaking out, pulling harmless pranks, or testing the limits of local patience. Teachers described him as bright but unfocused. Neighbors gossiped about his boldness, which some admired and others deeply mistrusted. Material comfort didn't satisfy him. He craved excitement, applause, sometimes just attention. Howard loved the spotlight, on the playground, at church, or on the baseball field. But with praise came discipline. His father, a man marked by the hardships of post-war America, dealt with slights through strict rules, extra chores, and lectures delivered in a voice as steady and unyielding as the Midwest wind. Instead of building character, those punishments poured resentment into Howard's young heart. Howard's coming of age was a tempest of contradictions. He was clever, persuasive, and sometimes generous, but just as often sneaky and defiant. His early school years were marked by average grades and occasional trouble, nothing outlandish, but enough to plant seeds of skepticism among teachers and peers. When he reached middle school, his need for status surpassed what his family could or would provide. Howard started borrowing things that weren't his: comic books, lunch money, a neighbor's bike. At first it was about thrill, later about keeping up appearances among a new crowd fixated on materialism. Despite his carefree exterior, Howard harbored growing frustration with the expectations heaped on him, especially as his big sister excelled in every area he failed. The constant comparison carved invisible scars onto Howard's ego, warping his self-image and fueling a determination to stand out, whatever the cost. During adolescence, Howard inherited his family's natural athleticism, joining school sports teams and earning passing applause, but never quite the respect or affection he longed for. He moved through high school as something of an enigma. Charming to some, untrustworthy to others, always restless and searching. His falling grades and mounting behavioral problems set him increasingly at odds with his father, who hoped a stint in the family's modest trucking business might whip the boy into shape. Howard, however, refused to be tethered to any path not wholly his own. It was this same stubborn refusal, fueled by pride, woundedness, and a smoldering hunger for admiration, that would shape the man Howard became. On the surface, he would soon wear the uniform of public service, saving lives and earning praise in one world, while in the shadows, he courted darker pleasures and built a second, secret life that no one close to him ever suspected. The double life of Howard K. West became legend not just for its crimes but for its chilling reminder. In America, sometimes the face of evil belongs to a man the town once called a hero. A rebel childhood and the first fractures. Howard K. West's childhood might have appeared enviable from the outside, a well-kept house with a manicured lawn in a friendly but unremarkable Midwestern neighborhood. His father, a blue-collar trucker hardened by decades of labor, upheld strict rules as his shield against the chaos of the outside world. His mother, tender in public but weary behind closed doors, prayed her two children would carry on some version of the American dream. Howard, however, absorbed restlessness like a second language. From his earliest days in kindergarten, his energy seemed to shimmer just beneath the surface, too intense to be contained by school walls or church pews. While his older sister embodied reliability and brought pride with each report card and school performance, Howard's name flickered through the halls mostly as a warning. Neighbors caught him climbing backyard fences, testing the limits, or egging on neighborhood dares that sometimes ended in tears or bruises. The whispers began early. That West boy's going to be trouble. they'd say out of earshot, not realizing his young mind picked up every syllable. His relationship with his parents grew strained as their approaches diverged. His father believed that hard lessons make stronger men, and met every infraction with punishments, extra chores, stern lectures, or sometimes just a disappointed silence that lingered long after the fact. Instead of instilling discipline or remorse, these punishments only seeded bitterness in Howard's heart. With each year, the gulf between him and his father widened, filled with unspoken words and competing definitions of manhood. School was no better. Howard was smart, remarkably so, according to teachers who saw glimmers of brilliance in his essays or quick wits during class debates. But his inability to sit still, his disregard for homework, and his willingness to push every rule meant his promise was always tempered by frustration. He was the type classmates admired for his daring sense of humor or sly tricks, but the kind teachers marked with red pens and sighs, always so much potential, so little focus. Materially, the Wests weren't hurting for much, at least by the standards of the time. Howard usually had change in his pocket for candy, baseball cards, or the newest toy fads. Yet nothing was ever enough. He wanted attention, thrill, and the rush of getting away with something forbidden. When his requests for more were denied, frustration festered. By age 8, he had started pocketing things that didn't belong to him. A toy truck here, an extra dessert from a lunch tray there. Each successful heist, no matter how small, fed a growing appetite for risk. The first major rupture came in middle school. His sister sailed into honors courses and after-school clubs, leaving Howard isolated with his misfit friends in the shadows of the gym or behind the bleachers. The comparisons at home became more pointed, the disappointment more suffocating. When teachers or neighbors pointed to his sister's achievements, Howard only dug in his heels, determined to stand out or rebel, no matter the cost. He graduated from petty theft to minor extortion, borrowing lunch money from younger kids, swiping comic books from corner stores, sometimes taking the blame for pranks he didn't even commit just for the validation of his troublemaking crew. Yet underneath each success, guilt and fear simmered. He worried, at least in the quiet of night, that he was making things worse for his parents. That maybe, just maybe, he was living down to everyone's lowest expectations. Still, the cycle persisted. The more he fell out of favor at school and at home, the more risks he took to feel alive, to feel special, to feel anything at all. Some adults labeled it a phase. A few, seeing something familiar behind his defiance, tried to reach out, only to be rebuffed. When he was caught, punishment rarely inspired remorse. It only affirmed his sense of being misunderstood or unjustly treated. The cracks began to widen during these years. By the time adolescence dawned, Howard West had grown used to living with dualities, public smiles and private scowls, the warmth of fleeting triumph, and the chill of deepening loneliness. The foundations of his character, so promising, so admired by some, were already riddled with fractures. No one, he believed, really saw who he was or what he might become, and in those darkening corners of his youth the seeds of something far more complicated and ultimately more dangerous took firm root. The first tumble, a criminal record takes shape. Howard's adolescent restlessness soon crystallized into a far more dangerous pattern. The mischief and minor transgressions of his childhood, once fueled by a search for attention or a petty thrill, evolved under the pressure of his growing discontent. By the time he reached high school, Howard operated in a liminal space, neither a full-fledged criminal nor an innocent teen, but something unsteady, unpredictable, and increasingly unmoored from the boundaries that kept most of his peers in check. The early 1960s in America were a period of cultural flux, as the civil rights movement brought passion and protest to the surface of public life, and small towns watched with wary eyes as youthful rebellion simmered everywhere. In Howard's Midwestern city, trouble wasn't hard to find for a boy determined to test himself against the world's rules. His grades, already mediocre, began to plummet. He stopped participating in sports. The clubs and circles that had once offered some stability receded, replaced by a new crowd, a loosely connected band of teenagers who shared one trait above all: a hunger for challenge, risk, and the occasional adrenaline rush of sticking it to the system. At first the crimes were minor and almost laughably naive. A stolen candy bar from the corner store after class, a wallet lifted from a locker left unattended in the school gym. These acts brought a thrill, a sense of power and cleverness, and, in the eyes of the small group that orbited him, a status he'd rarely known. The more success he tasted, the less he cared about the consequences, convinced, as many teens are of his own invincibility and anonymity. By his junior year, Howard's exploits had escalated. Shoplifting became breaking and entering. He and his friends would case affluent neighborhoods on the outskirts of town, looking for mailboxes overflowing with catalogs, a sure sign a family was on vacation, for open garage doors, for soft targets that promised an easy score and little risk. With every haul, be it a transistor radio, a handful of loose change, a bicycle quickly sold for cash, Howard felt the world's judgment recede behind the new currency of daring. His father, discovering missing tools or unexplained items, grew increasingly suspicious, but the confrontations at home led nowhere. Howard stonewalled, lied, and laughed it off. By then, he was far more afraid of being ordinary than being caught. But in the fall of 1965, Howard's run of luck came to an abrupt and dramatic end. While attempting to snatch a woman's purse outside a bustling downtown diner, his escape went wrong. She screamed, a bystander tackled him hard to the pavement, and police were on the scene almost instantly. With nowhere to run, Howard found himself in handcuffs for the first time as a crowd gaped, shamed, and murmured about that West boy. The investigation that followed unearthed a shocking pattern. Over the last 12 months, Howard had been linked, directly or circumstantially, to more than 20 acts of theft and breaking and entering around town. The cumulative losses seemed small in adult eyes, but the pattern painted him as a ringleader, a danger, a disappointment beyond hope. The system moved quickly. Howard was expelled from school and sentenced to a stint in juvenile reform school, a place notorious in the region for its drab walls, severe discipline, and meager path to redemption. The consequences reverberated instantly. Friends drifted away, unwilling to risk their own reputations or futures. His family suffered public humiliation, neighbors whispering and crossing the street to avoid conversation. Howard tasted, for the first time, the punishing force of American justice, stripped of the possibility of pretending he was simply misunderstood. When he emerged months later, he was a changed figure, without a diploma, with a criminal record, and with a well of bitterness that colored the way he saw his chances in the world. Growing up amid prejudice and a spiral of waywardness. Emerging from the juvenile corrections system, Howard K. West found little in the way of forgiveness or second chances. The small-town grapevine had done its work. Neighbors, shopkeepers, even old family friends now viewed him through a new, icy lens. No matter how clean his slate appeared on paper, whispers and caution followed his every move. Opportunities that might have once been his by virtue of family and hard work now seemed to evaporate. Howard would walk into room after room, job interviews, community events, even Sunday services, feeling the subtle, unmistakable shift in temperature. Voices lowered, glances narrowed. The pronouncement was silent, but clear. Once a troublemaker, always a troublemaker. Trying desperately to break free from the cage of his reputation, Howard took work wherever he could find it, often relying on the backbone of his father's connections in local industries. He slaved away on the floor of a noisy auto plant, surrounded by the metallic clang of machinery and the tense camaraderie of men who measured respect in calluses and stories swapped over cigarettes. Yet for all his sweat and punctuality, suspicion clung like motor oil. Whenever something went missing, a set of tools, some petty cash, even a manager's lunch, eyes darted in his direction. Co-workers' jokes, always just on the edge of malice, made him a convenient scapegoat. Once, after a string of thefts no one could pin on him, he was asked not to return. The message was as unmistakable as it was unjust. The injustice brewed inside him, a bitter mix of defiance and resignation. Instead of hard work restoring his place in the world, it only underscored how little room there was for mistakes in a place where grudges were nursed for generations. His friends from childhood had moved on, some to college, others to the service, a few already locked into the steady path of marriage and parenthood. Howard felt himself orphaned not just from his family, but from the entire fabric of the world that had once promised him possibility. It was in this vulnerable interlude that he met Sandra, a young waitress with her own heavy baggage and an instinct for lost souls. Their romance flared quickly, fed as much by need as by genuine attraction. For the first time in years, Howard recognized himself in another's eyes, not as a disappointment, but as someone who could be saved. But even love could not shield them from the weight of his past. Sandra's parents forbade their daughter from seeing that West boy. Some of her friends stopped speaking to her. The couple's late-night plans in diners and parking lots soon gave way to whispered talk of escape. Together they fled to New York, optimism briefly eclipsing anxiety as Howard promised Sandra and himself a new start, free from the shadow that haunted him. But the city, vast and indifferent, offered anonymity at a cost. Howard took work as a long-haul truck driver, life measured in endless highways, cheap motels, and the neon hush of truck stops. His relationship with Sandra became strained as the loneliness and financial pressures mounted. The debts grew, occasional brushes with the law for minor traffic or parking offenses brought back that old feeling of being watched, judged, never quite belonging. America, land of second chances, had little patience for its prodigal children. The spiral had not loosened its grip, in fact it was only beginning to twist tighter around him. Encountering tragedy and a fateful turn. Howard's struggle to outpace his own reputation was doomed to run smack into fate's most merciless obstacles. Life in New York for a time allowed him to disappear into a blur of city lights and nameless crowds. Just another anonymous dreamer chasing survival. He put in long shifts as a delivery driver, starting before dawn and ending long after dusk. His relationship with Sandra, already strained by exhaustion and mounting debts, began to show deeper fractures. But for all the daily indignities and the feeling of perpetual outsider, Howard believed, if only faintly, in the possibility of some kind of redemption even in this indifferent metropolis. All that hope was shattered in an instant. A robbery and gruesome murder rocked the very neighborhood where Howard happened to work, and the city's suspicion rapidly narrowed on persons with a criminal past. Howard's youthful record branded him as a likely culprit in the eyes of both police and community members, even as he tried desperately to explain he had no connection to the crime. The mounting pressure overwhelmed him. Late-night interrogations, newspaper headlines splashing his name, and former acquaintances whispering about that criminal West boy. Without evidence sufficient for charges, the police ultimately had to release him, but the damage was indelible. Sandra, devastated by the public shaming and frightened for their safety, withdrew even further. Neighbors and employers turned cold. Rent became impossible to pay, jobs grew scarce, and Howard slipped into a period of desperate, reckless spending, like he could burn away grief and injustice through sheer excess. Eventually, completely adrift, he called his father back in Missouri almost as a last resort. Hearing the distress in his son's voice, the old man, perhaps driven by guilt, perhaps by stubborn hope, convinced Howard to apply for the city fire department. To Howard's amazement, the hiring committee never discovered his sealed juvenile record. Suddenly, he was gifted a new uniform and a chance to serve. Firefighting, with its culture of camaraderie and its adrenaline-tinged heroics, suited Howard strangely well. He threw himself into drills and emergencies, earning the trust of his fellow firefighters and, for the first time in years, reluctant admiration from peers. It was as though he had finally outrun the shadow of his past, the city quietly whispering a second chance. Yet, as tragedy and suspicion had taught Howard, even fresh starts are fragile. The wounds left by betrayal and public scapegoating never truly faded. Underneath the crisp uniform, beneath the ash and sweat, remained a young man still thrashing against the currents of his own fate, unable to escape the feeling that at any moment it could all be swept away yet again. By day, a warrior, by night, a demon. Howard's life in New York soon settled into a rhythm that, on the surface, looked almost quaint. A steady paycheck from the fire department, the trust of his colleagues, and the tentative rebuilding of bridges burned by scandal and rumor. By day, he embraced his role as a public servant. Howard learned to move with purpose and discipline, to drag hoses through smoke, to haul terrified tenants from burning buildings, to listen for the smallest sound of a child trapped behind a locked door. He wore his uniform with pride, relishing the camaraderie of firehouse meals and the stories traded after grueling shifts. Whenever a grateful family offered a handshake or a local newspaper snapped his photograph, a piece of him believed, for a moment, in genuine redemption. But a darker impulse prowled beneath the daylight. Howard's compulsion for risk, and the debts left in the wake of earlier failures, never truly faded. The high of public adoration couldn't banish the growing sense of emptiness after each shift. As bills mounted and the city's cost of living pressed in, the old patterns of sabotage whispered their familiar comforts. If legitimacy offered no path out, perhaps cunning would. Nights found Howard taking on a new disguise. Slipping free of his uniform and moral obligations, he let himself vanish into New York's labyrinth of alleyways and crowded subways. While others slept, he hunted opportunity. What began as minor thefts, lifting wallets from the careless, scouting unattended vehicles, soon grew bolder. The anonymity of the metropolis fed his appetite for challenge. Each score, no matter how small, sparked a rush more potent than any medal or handshake. He started plotting and executing a string of burglaries with alarming precision, sometimes accompanied by a partner dragged from the fringes of firehouse society, more often alone. The city offered endless soft targets. Liquor stores shuttered after midnight. Lonely brownstone stoops, rich apartments left unguarded while owners vacationed. Howard's knowledge of city layout and police patterns, gleaned from daily heroics, became his greatest asset at night. It was as if the city itself became two distinct realms, the one he protected and the one he plundered. Over time, his exploits stretched beyond a single borough or city. As assignments with the fire department took him around the state, Howard seized chances to case new neighborhoods in cities like St. Louis, Chicago, and even Boston. Each time he left behind a puzzled police force struggling to connect the dots. The sudden spike in well-planned robberies, the uncanny knowledge shown by the suspect in avoiding patrols and alarms, the eerie absence of evidence. Every successful break-in emboldened him. By now, crime was no longer just an escape or a means to an end. It was his secret stage, the only place he felt in control. Money flowed, debts were staved off, and a perverse satisfaction glimmered each time he fooled both the public who lauded him and the authorities charged with finding him. Even as Howard moved up the ranks as a firefighter, collecting commendations and friendship, the duality of his existence deepened. He fostered new relationships, fellow first responders, grateful families, even a handful of vulnerable friends from his dicey past, each unaware that their trusted comrade stalked another world when night fell. His composure under fire became legendary. Not one soul suspected the chaos he sowed once the daylight faded. Yet with success came escalation. Simple larceny lost its thrill, replaced by a hunger to test the city's nerve and his own boundaries. He taunted fate, sometimes stealing from neighborhoods on the very blocks he swore to protect. At sunrise, he might rescue a shopkeeper's family. By midnight, he might empty the cash register of that same store. The contradiction gnawed at him, but the feeling was addictive. Each day a clean slate, every night a tantalizing risk. And so, the legend began to form. By day, a city's champion, a model for troubled youth. By night, the shadow that slipped through the city's cracks, taking whatever he pleased and giving nothing back but the faintest echo of regret. Howard K. West became the embodiment of two Americas, the one desperate for heroes, and the one that gave birth to monsters in the gentle glow of the streetlights. Criminal ladder, from theft to cold-blooded murder. Howard's transformation from daring thief to cold-blooded murderer did not happen in a single instant, but rather through a series of escalating choices, each one a little riskier, a little more brazen than the last. For years, he'd skirted the edge of danger, relying on his charm and his instincts to keep him safe. But New York's maze of streets, once a playground for his nighttime exploits, slowly hardened him. The city's darkness seeped into his bones, and the line between necessity and cruelty began to blur. At the start, his crimes remained focused on material gain. He targeted empty stores and affluent homes, striking with precision and leaving without a trace. Yet, as the thrill of stealing faded, he grew bolder, breaking into homes when he was sure residents were away, then, when debts or desperation grew, even while people slept inside. Each time he barely escaped discovery. Adrenaline drowned out common sense and morality both. Soon it wasn't enough to just take. He needed the rush that came from conquering new territory and new fears. The first time violence erupted was, as Howard later rationalized to himself, an accident. Caught by a startled homeowner during a midnight burglary, panic overpowered judgment. In the scuffle, Howard struck back violently, far harder than intended, he later claimed. But as the chaos subsided and silence returned, a chilling realization set in. He had crossed a threshold no act of charity by day could erase. Rather than shattering him, the act left Howard stunned but electrified by a grim sense of power. The city's headlines the following day mentioned only an unnamed intruder, and Howard, grateful for anonymity, found his remorse quickly drowned by the need to avoid detection. Violence became both shield and sword as he expanded his reach. He began carrying weapons during break-ins, ready for confrontation. He justified each new act, first as self-defense, then as necessary cleanup. Each time someone recognized him or threatened his freedom, his response grew faster, colder, more automatic. The victims blurred into types: shopkeepers who worked late, lone women returning home, guards unlucky enough to stumble upon him. Howard learned to move with a deadly calculation, staging scenes to suggest escapes or disguising motives if police grew too close. His confidence swelled as headlines multiplied, authorities speculating wildly about the identity and motive of the growing body count, never suspecting their own celebrated hero. By the late 1970s, Howard's dual life had twisted into macabre routine. By daylight, he earned standing ovations for dashing rescues and delicate saves. At night he stalked New York and other big cities, eyes cold, hands steady, heart untouched by anything but the next rush. Each successful job fed the myth inside him, that he was untouchable, above suspicion, and perhaps above redemption itself. As the death toll climbed, the police grew more desperate, but Howard's insider's knowledge kept him always one step ahead. With each passing year and each new crime, remorse faded until nothing remained but calculation and a hollow pride. The transformation was complete. Where there had once been a restless boy searching for meaning, there now walked a shadow, a man who had traded admiration for infamy, and whose embrace of his own darkness cast a chill no daylight could ever dispel. The rise of the media and the unmasking. Howard K. West's double life was destined for exposure in an America enthralled by news spectacle and ever hungry for both heroes and villains. He had crafted his dual identity with extraordinary cunning, confident that New York's sprawling chaos would keep his secrets forever obscured. For years his daylight persona as a courageous firefighter was burnished by local headlines. Tales of dramatic rescues, emotional reunions between survivors and their grateful families, even photos of Howard standing amid ashes, soot-streaked but smiling, capturing the public's imagination. His neighbors and colleagues saw him as a role model, proof that hard work and courage could win respect even for an outsider. What few could have suspected was that these very headlines provided camouflage for darker exploits undertaken after sundown. But by the late 1970s and early 1980s, reporting culture had fundamentally changed. New York tabloids now prowled for scandal, competition stiffened among television stations and magazines, desperate to outdo each other with ever more sensational stories. Reporters haunted police scanners and crime blotters, swarming to the scenes of robberies and murders with uncanny speed. And as the string of audacious nighttime break-ins, and eventually a spate of grisly homicides, spread along the city's arteries, speculation ignited. Law enforcement across New York, New Jersey, and Illinois found themselves under increasing pressure to produce results as terrified communities demanded answers. At first, the mere suggestion that one of the city's own firefighters could be linked to such chaos seemed absurd, tabloid fiction, the kind of wild rumor that barely survived the morning coffee crowd. Police departments typically dismissed the connection between daytime heroics and nighttime terror as the stuff of fantasies or conspiracy theories. Yet the mounting evidence, more than 300 thefts, a rising body count, and the eerie regularity with which major crimes coincided with Howard West's presence at fires or crime scenes, became impossible to ignore. Patterns started to emerge, subtle at first. A familiar shoe print near a burglarized bodega, a strand of ash-flecked uniform fabric, the unnerving fact that fires often broke out within blocks of major robberies, as if the perpetrator moved amid sirens unnoticed. The city's media seized on the mystery. Sensational headlines screamed from newsstands, hero or monster, the guardian angel with a dark side, serial killer amongst us. Composite sketches, vague, handsome, always slightly off, were splashed across the evening news, buttressed by interviews with breathless witnesses who recounted glimpses of a man disappearing into alleyways or vanishing behind row houses just as the first responders arrived. Underground rumors snowballed. Bets were laid at firehouse kitchens, radio hosts debated theories deep into the night, neighborhood watch groups armed themselves out of fear that evil might wear a trusted face. No single piece of evidence sealed Howard's fate. It took the unusual courage of a survivor, a corner store clerk who recognized the subtle, unique cadence of Howard's speech, even through a ski mask, to finally shatter the illusion. After a tense police lineup and a forensic blitz that cross-referenced timelines, surveillance footage, and the city's mountain of evidence, Howard's world collapsed. His arrest was a media phenomenon. Helicopters circled the block, reporters jostled for position outside the precinct, and instantly the fireman fiend name trended in headlines from coast to coast. Measured tributes of the past were replaced by savage denunciations, every public accolade refashioned as cruel irony. Some colleagues reeled in disbelief, others burned with shame for having missed the signs. As Howard's mugshot, haunted eyes, gaunt cheeks, still faintly marked by soot, flashed across every television, the question of how a trusted figure could hide in plain sight transfixed America. His exposure underscored the limits of hero worship and the power of relentless journalism in an era where no mask, no matter how carefully fitted, could survive the onslaught of media scrutiny forever. Courts, prisons, and the dark corners of humanity. Howard's downfall was as public and dramatic as his rise. Dragged from the firehouse in handcuffs, he became a symbol of betrayal, a living cautionary tale for everyone who had ever put their faith in a city's hero. The courtroom was not simply a battleground of evidence and testimony, it was a Gothic theater where prosecutors painted Howard as a near-mythic villain, and defense attorneys struggled to uncover shreds of his humanity beneath the mountain of evidence. The atmosphere during the trial was thick with sensationalism. Journalists packed the pews, sketch artists worked feverishly, and television crews loitered outside the courthouse, hungry for every gasp, every tearful testimony. The prosecution laid out volumes of evidence, forensic traces, witness statements, twisted timelines that revealed step by agonizing step just how seamlessly Howard had walked between the worlds of savior and predator. Again and again, footage of his rescues was played to shocked juries only to be followed by grim forensic images and victim statements, turning every heroic moment into bitter irony. Howard himself oscillated between stoic silence and occasional flashes of anger or regret. Sometimes he appeared composed, a seasoned firefighter used to high-stakes confrontation. Other times he looked shattered, newly aware of the yawning chasm between who he had pretended to be and what he had truly become. During victim impact statements, the room sat in near silence as parents, children, spouses recounted stories not of statistics, but holes left in families, dreams halted mid-flight, and an entire city's sense of safety stolen in the night. As the deliberations drew to a close, the verdict felt inevitable. Howard was convicted on hundreds of separate counts, including multiple murders, burglaries, assaults, and abuses of public trust. His sentence was life in prison, with no chance of parole. But the saga did not end at sentencing. For all the public venom cast his way, there were moments during Howard's time in jail that suggested the complexity of his character had not been completely extinguished. In the drab, claustrophobic confines of prison, Howard became reclusive at first, shunned by some inmates who recognized his infamy, approached warily by others. Yet as months passed, reports trickled out. Howard spent hours reading, teaching literacy classes to fellow inmates, and quietly penning a rough memoir. He volunteered to help maintain the prison library and, at times, intervened to break up fights on the yard. A few counselors described him in reports as guarded but not cruel, thoughtful in rare moments, or intelligently aware of his wrongs. Despite his efforts, the consequences were inescapable. No gesture of humility or service could erase the pain he'd caused. Letters from victims' families, sometimes furious, other times pleading for understanding, found their way to Howard's cell, each a reminder of the lives unalterably changed by his crimes. He answered some in longhand, searching for words that could bridge an impossible gap, but rarely heard back. His name, once synonymous with heroism, now served as a warning about the dangers of misplaced trust and the labyrinthine complexity of the human soul. In his final years, Howard's health deteriorated. Guards noted he rarely left his cell, except for work shifts or the occasional counseling session. In one of his last acts, he donated his earnings from prison labor to funds for the victims' children. These gestures were quiet, almost invisible to the outside world, but for a handful of those who closely watched his case, they hinted at a glimmer of remorse, a cautious answer to the question whether even those who fall furthest might try, in their twilight, to climb partway back toward the light. Epilogue: Lessons, Reflection, and a Haunting Warning. Standing at the end of Howard K. West's story, I can't help but feel the weight of conflicting emotions. There's sorrow for the many lives shattered by his actions, a cold fear at the ease with which darkness can wear a friendly face, but also a gnawing sense of accountability, because in some way, he was a product of the very society that celebrated, shunned, and ultimately destroyed him. His life is a prism through which we must examine not only his choices, but our own collective assumptions about good, evil, redemption, and justice. Howard was never just one thing. He didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a villain. He was the mischievous boy in a Midwestern yard, the firefighter racing up burning stairwells, the desperate fugitive haunted by longing and regret. His downfall exposes the perilous tension between the masks we wear and the truths we hide, the ideals we project and the doubts that fester beneath them. In many ways, Howard's greatest crime wasn't just breaking the law, but shattering the fragile contract each community keeps with those it calls heroes. When he fell, the whole city tasted a bitter lesson in trust and betrayal. Looking at the ashes of his legacy, I'm struck by the seductive simplicity of labels: criminal, hero, monster, martyr. But the truth, as Howard's life shows, is always more complicated. If his story teaches us anything, it's that empathy and vigilance must endure side by side. Had those around him looked deeper, offered real second chances instead of cold suspicion, might history have unfolded differently? Or was Howard's fate sealed by the churning inequalities and prejudices of the very world he tried and failed to conquer? There's a warning here, not only about the seduction of power and the corrosive dangers of double lives, but also about the responsibility each of us bears in shaping community, offering grace, and refusing to let people disappear into shadow. Heroes must always be held to account, but so must the societies that make, break, and sometimes abandon them. If Howard's tale lingers in our memory, let it be as a call to see each other more honestly, to reach out before indifference hardens into tragedy, and to never stop questioning the blurry boundaries between light and darkness that define the human soul.